Transformation in America's largest church, which won over 5 book awards, including Selection as Choice Outstanding Academic Title. He has also recently published Theologies of Guadalupe, From the Era of the Conquest to Pope Francis, which is really the book that brought my research interest in contact with Dr. Matovina, and so I'm very happy that he's able to share his expertise with us this evening with a lecture entitled The Gospel on Native Cloth, Theologies of Guadalupe in America. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest. Thank you.
Well, Our Lady of Guadalupe is a luminous presence, and I guess I'm imitating her tonight. Maybe if I stand to the side a little bit, you'll be able to see me a little bit. It's intimidating to sit there. Let's begin with a little kind of a prayer text. The Nahuatl, the language that Our Lady of Guadalupe spoke, Nahuatl, the apparition account in Nahuatl is in a document called the Nican Mopahoa. So it's kind of like the Gospel of Guadalupe for people who are devoted to her. So I want to read a small text from that. It's kind of a meditation to start. It's a challenging text, my favorite from the Nican Mopahoa. Juan Diego, you may know the story. He sees this beautiful image, and she asks him to have the bishop build a chapel on that spot so she can show her love to all her people. And it's kind of almost comedic back and forth between the bishop's palace and coming back to Tepeyac, because he doesn't at first believe him. And in one of these instances, when the bishop has doubted Juan Diego's testimony, he comes back with the idea that he'll just ask her to send somebody else, because he's a poor person, he's uneducated, he's not being believed, he doesn't have the dignity to do this. This is the exchange he has with her upon returning from the unsuccessful visit to the bishop to get him to build the chapel. In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. From the Nican Mopahoa. Hence I very much beg you, my owner, my queen, my child, that you charge one of the more valuable nobles, a well-known person, one who is respected and esteemed, to come by and take your message and your word so that he may be believed. Because in reality, I am one of those campesinos, a piece of rope, a small ladder, the excrement of people. I am a leaf. They order me around, lead me by force. And you, my most abandoned daughter, my child, my lady, and my queen, send me to a place where I do not belong. Forgive me. I will cause pain to your countenance and to your heart. I will displease you and fall under your wrath, my lady and my owner. The ever-venerated Virgin answered, Listen, my most abandoned son. Know well in your heart that you are not a few. There are not a few of my servants and messengers to whom I could give the mandate of taking my thought and my word, so that my will may be accomplished. But it is absolutely necessary that you personally go and speak about this, and that precisely through your meditation and help, my wish and my desire be realized. I beg you very much, my most abandoned son, and with all my energy, I command that precisely tomorrow you go again to see the bishop. Well, first, if you're not used to hearing Nahuatl, or even Nahuatl translated into English, you may have noticed there's a lot of things in there that maybe sound odd. That he keeps calling her abandoned and my little child. This diminutive form is very common in the Nahuatl. It carries over into Mexican Spanish. Castilian Spanish doesn't use the diminutive nearly as much as Mexican Spanish. And that comes from the native Nahuatl language. Those are all very much terms of endearment. This conversation, if you grasped the aura of the original Nahuatl, it's very affectionate, it's very intimate, And all those little turns of phrase that sound a little bit odd in English actually have those intimacy meanings in Nahuatl. Juan Diego had internalized the effects of the conquest. He thought, I'm a native person. I'm not worthy like the rest. Send somebody else. And in the great wisdom and love of Guadalupe, she says, Juan Diego, there's lots of people I could get to do this. It must be you. The most powerful sentiment for me of the Nican Mapoa. Juan Diego, it must be you. She had already told him in an earlier meeting that he was dignified and loved, and he was her beloved son. But hearing the words when you've been put down a lot in your life are not enough. You need the actions that finally you will be believed, you will be respected, and those who have rejected you or put you down will see you as a brother, as an equal, as a sister. And so for Guadalupe, she recognizes this institution that you run is a place of formation. This is the formation of Juan Diego. He is not going to be of any evangelical use if he thinks he's not truly created in the image and likeness of God. If he's not worthy. He's not better than anybody else. He's not worse than anybody else either. He too is a child of God. This is the process of Juan Diego's conversion to coming to believe in his own full humanity. It's his liberation so that he can be freed to be the evangelizer she is calling him to be. Very powerful stuff. So tonight I just want to think with you a bit about some of the theologies of Guadalupe. First, I'm going to make a bold claim, and we'll come back to this part of the story a little later when we talk about the theme of conversion. But first I want to make a bold claim. I think it's true. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I think Guadalupe is the only tradition in the Catholic Church, the only Marian tradition, that has a developed theological literature. You know, we have Lourdes and Fatima, and there's many Marian images, and there are books written about them, and certainly many testimonies of miracles and things that have happened. But in terms of an actual theological literature, Guadalupe is the only one I know that, starting in the 17th century and up till now, every generation of Mexican Catholicism, and now actually theologians from other countries outside of Mexico, including the United States and Canada, Europe, and around the world, have developed a theological literature of Guadalupe. Fascinating. Actually, Pablo is working on the first English translation of the first Theology of Guadalupe, written by a priest named Miguel Sanchez in 1648. It's never been translated into English. In fact, it wasn't re-released in Spanish until the 20th century. And thankfully, Pablo's working on that. It's going to be more well-known. God willing, it should be. From that forward, you know, there's all these books that have been written. And what these books do, and this is a huge summary of over almost 400 years of theological literature, they look at the Nican Mapoa, the story of the apparitions. They look at the image itself. And they look at the devotion that people have to Guadalupe, the story, the image, and the devotion. Those are the three theological sources. Some of them look at more at one, some of them look more at the other, some of them look at all three. But they try to ask, what is the meaning of Guadalupe for our lives as Catholics, our lives as disciples, based on her encounter with Juan Diego, based on the image itself, based on the devotion that's developed to her. Maybe perhaps somewhat surprisingly, I'll give you a summary of this is what that last book that he mentioned was all about. So you're getting a thumbnail sketch of that book. I've been reading this stuff for 40 years. I was telling them at dinner, I am a Guadalupe junkie. I just can never get it. I do other things too, but I can't get enough of Guadalupe. I just utterly fascinated by this. I've never seen anything so powerful, speaking into people's lives, devotionally powerful as Guadalupe. The first time I went to the Basilica, I said, there is something here that's not like other Marian experiences that I have had. But if you look at this thing, it's kind of interesting. You know, we have Mary of Nazareth in the Gospels, and we have the four Marian dogmas of the Catholic Church: Mary, Mother of God, her perpetual virginity, Immaculate Conception, and the Assumption. But these books, over centuries now, although of course they speak of her as Mary, and obviously they believe what the church teaches about Mary, this theology is not really about Mary, the theology of Mary per se. From Miguel Sanchez, the very first one forward, all the way up to John Paul II, the Pope who spoke the most about Guadalupe, and Pope Francis, who gave a beautiful homily when he visited Mexico in 2016, what they really talk about is Guadalupe and the evangelization of the New World. She's Mary, they speak to her as Mary, but they don't talk about her in the usual ways we would study Mary in a theology class. You know, Mary in the scriptures, Mary in the magisterium, Mary in the dogmas. No, it's Mary the evangelizer of the New World. And every generation, and in some ways, if you think about it this way, Christianity in this hemisphere, here in Edmonton and all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, Christianity in the Western Hemisphere is only 500 years old. We are still new churches, really, all of us. Some of our churches are getting old now. It may feel like some of us are getting old. It may feel like we are baby Christians in terms of the whole history of Christianity. And in the second millennium of Christianity, I think arguably the two most important events were the Reformation, Catholic and Protestant, and the missionary works in the New World and also Asia and Africa. Those were two of the biggest developments that took the church into new places, took the faith into new places in the last 1,000 years. And in the New World, what Guadalupe really becomes, generation after generation thinks about Guadalupe in terms of the evangelization of this continent, in Mexico, but not just in Mexico. She's the patroness of the entire continent. And thinks about what each generation is responding to of, basically, Guadalupe is to develop a theology of America. What is the meaning of America in the 2,000-year history of the Christian faith on this planet? What role does America play? And Guadalupe has been a way that theologians, pastors, popes, bishops, preachers have thought about what is the role of America in the unfolding of revelation and God's plan to save humanity. Early on, they actually had many debates in Spain about how is it, there was a real dilemma for these earliest theologians after Columbus got lost and supposedly discovered America. They asked, how is it that the Gospels say that the apostles preached to the ends of the earth, and yet we've encountered these millions of people who have never heard the name of Christ? It was a real crisis for them, a theological crisis. Are the Gospels wrong? Did we get this wrong? What has happened here? One of the things they eventually said about Guadalupe is, well, we don't understand why it is that in God's providence, the gospel did not reach the ends of the earth in the generation after Christ. We don't know why that happened. But we do know that God has a plan for salvation, and it seems, these preachers said in Mexico, that God saved the old world for the preaching of the apostles and converted people by the word of God. And for the native peoples who had more of a visual culture, he saved them and sent his own mother to evangelize them by the image, not by the word. Now, that was their theological reflection. I'm not saying that that's, literally biblical truth, but they were, from the very beginning of the Guadalupe tradition, grappling with where does America fit in the plan of salvation history? And Guadalupe was a way for them to think more, and for us to think more deeply about what it means to be the church in America. And I'm using America, as John Paul II did intentionally, in the singular. Because what John Paul II said, we should not talk about the Americas, but America. Because there's one gospel, there's one faith, and I'm from the United States, even when we have certain xenophobic political stances, we should recognize that we really are one people. We are one humanity. And the destiny of all of us in this hemisphere is associated with the destiny of everyone else. So, Guadalupe in America. That's what I want to talk with you about tonight then. Just some of the ways that this tradition has developed and the theological reflections of Guadalupe and how they help us to think about Christianity in this hemisphere. So let me begin with something kind of before the theology. Why Guadalupe? I think one of the most, and I've worked on this, besides the theology, I've worked on the history of the devotion to Guadalupe. And one of the most fascinating questions is, how did Guadalupe get to be Guadalupe? There were over 500 miraculous images of Christ, Mary, and the saints in colonial Mexico. Over 50 miraculous images of the Virgin Mary alone in Mexico City, where Guadalupe is now. She started out, it was a small chapel. Have any of you ever been to Tepeyac? Have you ever been to the Basilica? Your little chapel that's on the top of the hill? I mean, that's what was there for the first century. The only thing that was there was a chapel after, the time of Juan Diego's life. So it starts out rather small, and over time it grows, and that's a fascinating story. So one of the things that I've looked at in my research is what are the concentric circles of the devotion growing? And how eventually does it grow from being a small local devotion to a citywide devotion in Mexico City, to a regional devotion, to the patroness of New Spain, and eventually the patroness of all America, and now Guadalupe is literally on every continent. If you go to the rebuilt Notre Dame du Paris in Paris, the most visited side altar there is the Guadalupe altar. If you go there are Guadalupe parishes in Asia, in Africa. If you go to the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, next to the bones of St. Peter, in the crypt of St. Peter's, there's a chapel to Guadalupe that Pope John Paul II built. Literally, she's become totally international. So one question is, why Guadalupe? Well, part of the answer is the answer why any devotion or any image of Mary of the Saints grows is miracles. People give testimony and word spreads. And I'm sorry, I don't know how well you can see this. We didn't realize it was going to be so sunny tonight. It's nice and sunny in Canada. Thank you for welcoming me so well. When Pablo invited me, he said, when do you want to come? I said, what's the latest date you can give me? I don't want to go. I'm in Texas. I don't want to go there when it's snowing. So excuse me. This is largely my fault that the sun is shining so brightly tonight. This, I don't know if you can see it. It's called El Primer Milagro, the first miracle. Boy, you really can't see it very well, can you? There's a procession up there across that causeway, the bridge. Mexico City was built on a lagoon. You can still, when you go there today, you can still go to a place called Xochimilco and ride gondolas. It's like Venice. But Xochimilco will remind you of what Mexico City used to be like when it was Tenochtitlan, when the Aztecs ruled it. So there were these four causeways from the center, where the cathedral is now, the center of town, had one to the north, south, east, and west. So they were processing out from the center of the town, where the cathedral is, out to where the basilica is now, which is now part of Mexico City, but back then it was outside of town, 3 miles north of the central plaza. So this is the procession when they're taking the image of Guadalupe, which Juan Diego had taken and shown to the bishop, and now they're taking it back out to Tepeyac to put it in the chapel that they built. And there's an indigenous person here. The indigenous had a custom of shooting arrows. It was like mock battles, but it was a festival thing that they would do for any. And so they, like with many other festivals, they did this. And one of them accidentally got shot with one of the arrows. And so they brought this indigenous person before Guadalupe, and that was the first miracle ever recorded at the shrine, that he was healed of this arrow wound that he'd gotten from this mock battle in the festivities where they were enshrining. And of course, stories of that began to spread a bit. And one of the miracles that began to spread Guadalupe's fame. All right, this is another one. In 1622, so about a century after the traditional date for the apparitions, the first big church was built at Tepeyac. And to raise money, they made this kind of little holy card. And there's Guadalupe in the middle. And what you see here on the sides are 8 panels. And they're ex votos, they're milagritos, they're little pictures of a favor that Guadalupe, or a miracle she granted some devotee. So people would, when they were praying for something, and then when they were offering thanks for having received it, they still do this today. They would go and leave a little picture of it there at the shrine, or a picture of the person who had been helped, a soldier that was sent off to war, someone who had been healed, or any other kind of, someone who passed a test. I think you're close to finals week now. They would leave these things there. And so this picture depicts 8 of the early miracles, and it's put into a holy card that was given to donors as they were making the first church. So here, what you see is her fame is growing. Like at any shrine, her fame is growing. A real turning point happened in the 18th century. There was a huge typhoid epidemic in Mexico City, in the environs. Over 200,000 people died. This is kind of like COVID back then. People were dying right, left, and center. So, as was the custom in those years, they would turn to different intercessors to ask for that this plague be alleviated. And they kind of just did serial patron saints. They'd bring out St. Anthony, and if the plague continued, they'd say, well, he didn't work. They'd put him back, and they'd bring out Our Lady of Loreto, and so on. Well, in this instance, they brought out 30 different saints, until finally they turned to Guadalupe and did a novena to her. And she was given the credit that the epidemic abated. And that was a real turning point. Within a decade after this event, they were petitioning Rome to declare Guadalupe the patroness of New Spain and to give her a liturgical feast day, which Pope Gregory the 14th, a couple Gregories before Benedict, a couple of Benedicts before the more recent Benedict in 1751 did that. That's when Guadalupe really then grew in devotional permanence all throughout Mexico. So it was a couple 100-year process. So like any other image or devotion, why does this one grow? Because miracles and help are attributed to her. But not only that. From the very beginning, it was very important, and you can see this in the history, Guadalupe appealed to multicultural group of people. The native peoples, the Spaniards, the castas, that is the mixed race people, black, native, and Spanish, white, European, these mixed and formed new races of people, and all of them found in Guadalupe a particular help for their community, for their needs. Men, women, rich, poor. From the very beginning, Guadalupe was extremely multivocal, spoke to many different needs and to many different cross-sections of the people. They all didn't have the same devotion to her. They all had devotion to her. They all went to her different needs and saw her in different ways, but collectively they had the same devotion. So that's been a powerful part of this from the very beginning. The other piece I already mentioned, these theology books, beginning with Miguel Sanchez, the one that Pablo's translating. Once these theology books get written, the Guadalupe apparition, which is the Guadalupe devotion, which is kind of a pious thing, gets taught more in seminaries. And it becomes more and more a way to evangelize the native peoples and all peoples. And so the theological writings about Guadalupe have a major effect on its growing importance. And eventually, she does become the most important, the most venerated Marian image in all of Mexico. But she's not the only one. You still have, for example, Our Lady of San Juan de los Lagos, still a very famous Marian shrine in Jalisco. Not as famous as Guadalupe. So she's not the only one, but she becomes the most important and famous one. Another reason for this, some of this stuff is just coincidental. Tepeyac, where Guadalupe is, the basilica, is the place where visiting dignitaries from Spain, they would land at Veracruz, they would come overland to Mexico City, and they would officially be welcomed into the city through the road that went right by Tepeyac. And so it became a custom already in the 16th century for the viceroy and the archbishop to go out to Tepeyac to meet arriving dignitaries, because it happened to be located at a point where the road turned to the east to go to Veracruz, the Atlantic, to the north to the rich silver mines. And so by coincidence of where it was, this particular shrine gained greater importance among the more elite members of Spanish colonial society. It also had the advantage, Guadalupe, that she was, quote unquote, born in the New World. Most of the Marian images had come from Spain. This was native, and that meant a lot to the people of the land. And the fact that Mexico City was the style center of the empire, it was the capital. So there are other factors too. You can read my book if you want to know more about this. But the first point I'm making is simply this. There's a story behind Guadalupe. there's a story of how what starts as a rather small devotion on a hill becomes a national and then an international phenomenon. All right, let's talk those in the main topic tonight. Let's talk some more about the theology. And what I really want to do tonight is just give you some of the themes. This isn't all of them. I am weaning out 4, 3, 5 points. I'll see how many I get to in the time allotted from 400 years of theological history. What I think would be some of the major themes, and or maybe some that I think might be of most interest to you. So this is selective thematic understanding of the theology of Guadalupe. So I want to talk about this. I know Pope Francis was recently here. I was telling them at dinner, a student of mine doing her PhD at Notre Dame just defended her dissertation last week. And one of her subject matters was Lac de Saint Anne, or just right near here. Because she was studying Native American encounters with Catholicism, for the struggles that that's entailed, and for the way that that's actually helped advance the Catholic faith among the Native peoples and among all of us. And one of the powerful ways that theologians have spoken about Guadalupe is that she really enculturates the faith. St. Pope John Paul II said she is the model of a perfectly enculturated evangelization. She really brings the faith in the way that natives can understand it. Many missionaries tried to force the native peoples of central Mexico, the Nahua peoples, the Aztecs, those are interchangeable. Nahua is the language. Aztec is one of the groups that spoke that language. Tried to force them to become Catholics in many ways. And Guadalupe never forced them. She appeared to them and spoke to them within their own cultural and spiritual heritage in a way that welcomed them into the church and helped them to understand it. So just to give a couple examples, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this because the Pope was just here. I understand, I didn't know this tonight till Jason told me. The Pope stayed right here. He stayed at your house. So I mean, this was a big deal, I guess, for Edmonton. I don't know. It would have been for me if I was living here. And part of that was the encounter and the asking for forgiveness for the church's treatment of native peoples. So the way Guadalupe commits to this theme, which has been there since Miguel Sanchez forward, is very powerful. And John Paul II, this is one of his big points. So, the first encounter between Juan Diego and Our Lady Guadalupe is really seeped in this bringing together of native culture and spirituality and Catholicism. And the whole Nican Mapowa is a beautiful poetic interweaving of the native people's life and the life of Catholics, and the image itself, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Juan Diego's, as the story goes in the Nican Mapowa, he's going to catechism class, but he hears beautiful music. And for the Nahuas, music was the way God spoke. In fact, the way they would speak about, philosophical and theological and important things was through an expression called disfracismos. A disfracismo is a taking of two words. Often they're kind of opposite with one another. Sometimes they're related. But you take two words and you combine them, and that speaks a philosophical, theological thought. So the way they talked about divine revelation, the speaking of the gods to humanity, was through floricanto, flower in song. And so it's no surprise that the Nican Mapowa, Juan Diego is first attracted by music. And the end of the story, if you know it, is he gathers flowers in his cloak. That's the miracle, flowers growing in December. He takes them before the bishop, and then the image appears on the cloak. So the whole story begins and ends with flower and song. For the native peoples, that would have said right away, something divine is being communicated here. So it's beautiful music. It's the experience of beauty, the experience which is so often associated with the experience of the divine and Nahuatl thought, that attracts him to the top of Tepeyac Hill. Tepeyac Hill, of course, was a place where natives that was a ritual site for them in their pre-Christian religious times. So he goes to the top of Tepeyac, and what he sees is not only is she this heavenly, beautiful woman, the whole scene around her is transformed. Even the cacti and the thorns glisten as beautiful, diamonds and pearls and all kinds of precious things. So there's a transformation of the entire environment that says to him he's having some kind of a mystical experience here. And then she speaks to him. And like so many of the stories of the gospel, her first words are rehabilitating words. Her very first words, according to Nika Mapoa, dignified Juan Diego. As a native, he'd been told, as I said earlier, that he was unworthy, that he didn't measure up. They never even allowed the natives to become priests or religious because they said they just couldn't quite be holy enough. Baptism, yes, perhaps, but not orders or vows, because they were not considered to be worthy enough. And her first words to him are, dignified Juan Diego. She's telling him, all these things that you've heard and all these things you've come to believe about yourself are false. You too are a child of God. That's not easy. I read you at the very beginning a passage that comes later. And clearly Juan Diego still hasn't gotten the message yet, because he comes back when the bishop won't believe him, and he still hasn't believed that beautiful message. It takes a while for that to grow on him. Actually, it takes a while for that to grow on every single one of us. Think of young people today and us not so young people. How social media in the world beats us down, and we start to think we're no good. I don't wear the right clothes. I don't go to the right places. I don't drive the right car. I'm less than everybody else. This feeling of unworthiness. But it starts there. I'm reminded in this text, I love that text, it's in Mark and in parallels. You know the one where Jesus heals the woman who had the hemorrhage, spent all her money on doctors and all that? You know this story, of course, I don't repeat all that. And Jesus says, who touched me? And they say, well, what do you mean who touched you? Everybody's touching you. There was a big crowd around here. He said, no, somebody touched me. He felt the power come out of him. And throughout, the woman has been healed. But Jesus he's speaking to everybody else. But if you do your Ignatian prayer and imagine that scene as you read through that gospel, he never speaks to her till the very last verse of the text, when finally she comes before him and he recognizes that she's the one that's done it. And then his first word to her is, daughter, your faith has healed you. Daughter. I think of that woman the same way I think of Juan Diego. She had the flow of blood, which would have meant for many of her neighbors, perhaps she was impure. She was unworthy. She couldn't go in the temple precincts. Maybe they even felt like Job's supposed friends told him, you're being punished. This is chastisement for a sin you've committed. Obviously you're a sinner. You're dirty. You're unholy. And that's why God is allowing this to happen. The woman came for a physical healing, but I think what the Lord saw was a deeper need for a spiritual healing. And the most powerful thing to me in the text is not that he heals her physically, as beautiful as that is, that he looks into her soul and his very first word is, daughter. Do not listen to what the rest of those people are saying, even pious and holy and faithful people who are saying all those negative things about you. You are a daughter. You matter. You are somebody. Not better than anybody else, not lower than anybody else. One in humanity with everybody else. So just as Jesus calls that woman a daughter to rehabilitate her soul, Guadalupe says, dignified Juan Diego to rehabilitate his soul. He then, starts to have these conversations with her. She starts to speak with him about what she wants to do. And I want to read this text. One of the first things she says to him after dignified Juan Diego and she greets him, she says this, know and be certain in your heart, my most abandoned son, that I am the ever-virgin Holy Mary, Mother of God of great truth, Teotl, of the one through whom we live, the creator of persons, the owner of what is near and together, the Lord of heaven and earth. Now, you can see it easier in the Nahuatl, but you can hear it in the English too. From the very beginning, and now this is very striking, this is the 16th century. This isn't post-Vatican II enculturation theologians. This is the 16th century. And she's interweaving the names for God of the Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, and of the Nahuatl tradition. You heard one of them, Teotl, but I'm sure you maybe recognize these. The owner of what is near and together. That's not a Christian expression. That one is directly from the Nahuatl. So she's interweaving both the Christian and the Nahuatl and basically saying, you don't have to give up the religion that you've had. You don't have to give up, the way many of the missionaries were trying to beat the native religion out of them. We've not come to take away your religion. We've come to fulfill it. We've come to invite you to partake in what we're offering here, what Mary is offering. Of course, Mary Guadalupe is a pregnant image as well. She's bringing Christ to be born in the new world. If you look at her image, and I was told that was not put up just for this talk, that you actually have that there, so I congratulate your directors here, that Guadalupe is already present here. She does appear everywhere, so even here in your institution. If you look at it, the image is just like the story. And I could do many, many more examples. I only gave you a few from the initial encounter. But if you read the Nican Mapoa, it's laden with Christian and Nawa elements interwoven together. And so is the image. Now, looking at that, it's very much the classical pose of the Immaculate Conception from the late Middle Ages and early modern era. She's standing on the moon. I mean, read Revelations 12. You can see this woman is very much reflected in Scripture. In fact, Revelations 12 was associated with Guadalupe and Miguel Sanchez's The First Theology book on Guadalupe. And she's clearly Mary, the Mother of God. So there's also, her demeanor, her stance, and so on. But she's also blocking out the sun, standing on the moon, and has the stars on her mantle. These cosmological elements, which are there also in Catholic imagery, but are very important in Nahua native imagery. The Nahuas believe, you've seen the Aztec calendars, which was more accurate than the Gregorian calendar. The Aztec calendar had 52-year cycles. And the belief was that after every 52 years, the world ended. And you held vigil all night long, praying that a new age would be born with the dawn of the new day, the next day. And so the twilight of the stars was the birth of a new era, and she's got those stars on her mantle, kind of representing the birth of this new age. And she's also standing on the sun and blocking out the moon, not destroying them, but coming forth, emanating from them. And if you go to Mexico City, the other thing you got to go see Juan Diego's house, you got to go to the Basilica, you got to go to Xochimilco, then you have to go to Teotihuacan, the famous pyramids that are just a short distance outside of Mexico City. There are two great pyramids, larger than the Egyptian pyramids that you can see in Egypt. One of them is to the sun god, one of them is to the moon god. And here she is, not destroying their sense of who God was, but emanating out from that sense and bringing something new that's meant to invite to its fulfillment. All right, well, there's much more to say about this, but I'm going to move on to other themes in the interest of time. Oh my, time is really flying already. But the point I'm trying to make here, though, is one of the great themes of Guadalupe, she's an evangelizer, but an evangelizer that works within the culture of the local people. And just to give a couple visual images of that. Oops. Oh, this is going backwards now. Okay, there. Okay. Here's one of the early pictorial images of Guadalupe. Notice Spanish nobility on one side and native nobility on the other. She comes to reconcile the Spanish and the native in the waters of baptism. So again, she's not coming to have one group dominate the other, but to bring both together and to create a new and powerful expression of our Catholic faith. I'm sorry, I couldn't find one with a Canadian flag. I'm not trying to be chauvinistic here, but here you have a celebration back in the United States and how Guadalupe brings together the U.S., American, and the Mexican into a greater harmony. She's bringing harmony between peoples. And here's one of my favorites. This is drawn by it's drawn by a Korean artist. And that's a Korean Guadalupe and a Korean Juan Diego. And it's this artist, she's a pious Catholic woman, it's her expression of who Guadalupe is for her as a Korean Catholic woman. So Guadalupe has been an image and a tradition that's helped enculturate the Catholic faith among various kinds of peoples and bring diverse peoples together, which is what Catholicism should be. I mean, you think about it, the 2,000 years of our church, the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, Catholicism has always had the genius of bringing in local cultures and allowing those cultures to enrich and be enriched by the Catholic faith. And Guadalupe is a preeminent example of that. Guadalupe as an enculturated evangelator is probably the main theological theme through the 400 years of this work. All right, let's go to a couple others, and I might not get them all, but let's at least try to do a few more. So justice and human dignity. I think this is the other one that's most emphasized by contemporary theologians. This came home to me years ago. I lived in San Antonio. That's where I met and married my wife. By the way, are there any oblate priests here? I know oblates have been very prominent around here. They also are in San Antonio. There's an oblate seminary in San Antonio. And on that oblate seminary, there's a beautiful image of Our Lady of Lourdes, which has been there a long time because the oblates came from France. But in that beautiful outdoor grotto, around the back, they put an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe a long time ago. It's been there a while now. So there's a grotto to Lourdes, but also Guadalupe. And when I proposed to my wife, I did it at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio in front of the image of Guadalupe. And if you don't mind a short little personal story, I've always been desperately in love with my wife, so I planned this all out. I had it all ready and took her out. She should have known something was up. I got a whole bottle. I'm cheap, but I got a whole bottle of wine at dinner because I was trying to, put her in a good mood and prime the. And I said, let's go take a walk and let's go say a prayer. And she says, well, I don't know. It's kind of. I said, no. She says, it's kind of dark. I said, let's go over here. And I had it all worked out. I was going to go around and I was going to propose to her before the image of Guadalupe. So we got back there. It's a little bit dark, but there's night lights you can see. And shoot, there was these people up there that were already saying their prayers and everything up there where Juan Diego and Guadalupe is. So I told Elliot, I said, just wait here. I got to go talk to those people. She said, do you know those people? I said, not yet. I want to go over there and talk to them. So I went over there and I said, excuse me, do you mind? I just took that beautiful woman out to dinner and I want to ask her to marry me in front of the image of Guadalupe. They said, okay, we'll step back. We're here too for you to get her blessing as well. We're mariachis, and they had all their instruments. We're asking her to bless our new mariachi instruments, but we got plenty of time. You go ahead. Yours is more important. So they step back, and I go up there with Lita, and I kneel before her, and take the ring out and give her an embrace, and they realize that this has worked, and they start singing. And she said, you got mariachi? I said, babe, what could I tell you? I eventually told her the truth. I confessed. But anyways, in San Antonio is where I first came to a lot of this experience of Guadalupe. And one of the first most powerful experiences was at the cathedral there, where they have this big event called the Serenata, the serenade. And you serenade Mary the eve before her feast. So her feast day is December 12th. This is December 11th in the evening. You serenade her like a young mariachi would serenade his girlfriend or his wife from her balcony on her birthday. You sing love songs to Our Lady. That's basically what it is. And they even get, like popular singers who sing a love song that might be a love song between a man and a woman, but it's appropriately a love song sung to Our Lady. So this goes on and it was actually televised throughout the Americas. It was this very, very popular event that they had there. And in the middle of it, they act out the apparitions. The story that I was reading from, they do this in a lot of churches. Maybe they even do it here in Edmonton at your Spanish-speaking parish. But a lot of parishes, this is done. Somebody is Juan Diego, somebody's Guadalupe, and they act out. Somebody's the bishop, they act this all out. So it was the first time I'd seen it, and it was done very, very well, very dramatically. Juan Diego was kind of humped. And you can see him, even his bodily gestures, it's like he's beat down, And he goes and he kneels before the bishop and nobody believes him and he goes back and he's dejected. And as this is going on, I'm looking around me, because the cathedral is packed, of course. And seeing some people dressed very nicely in guayaberas and fancy dresses, and a lot of people just in work clothes, flannel shirts and blue jeans and so on. And as Juan Diego is being humiliated in this drama, I mean, they're kind of wincing. You can see it's like they really are getting into this. It's like they're taking it personally, What's happening to Juan Diego, I mean, I imagined later as I reflected on it, this is what happens to them, when they go to government offices. And these were immigrant people and Latino people who often experience racism in my country, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. So they're really identifying with this. And then at the very end of it, of course, Juan Diego takes the roses that he's gathered at the hill and he drops them before the bishop. And as he drops them and stretches out his hands, for the first time in that drama, Juan Diego stands tall. He stands dignified, not because he's proud or anything, but because he's got to spread his arms out so that the bishop can see what's on the tilma. And then the bishop kneels before Our Lady, and the bishop's assistants who had scoffed at Juan Diego and ridiculed Juan Diego, they all kneel before Guadalupe. But in kneeling before Guadalupe, they also kneel before Juan Diego. And at this moment, the cathedral filled with those devotees who had been wincing and squirming in their seats as they watched Juan Diego, they gave a huge round of applause, which at first seemed to me like, well, okay, the proclamation is over and they appreciate what the young people but then I thought to myself, this is way more than that. They are not just applauding the little drama we just saw. I didn't think this all at that moment. I've thought about this for the last 30 years. They're applauding the story of America. They're applauding the story of America. From the very beginning, native peoples, and by extension, immigrants, Latino people, gay people, women, you name it. Anybody who's felt rejected or put down. And even those of us who are pretty privileged. We've all been Juan Diego. We've all had that feeling that the door's being slammed in my face. People don't care about me. People don't think much of me. God, I was mentioning social media either. I think we have an epidemic with young people now, where they bully each other, and this, I don't know, I hope it's not too bad in Edmonton, but I get the feeling it's the same everywhere. That people are constantly tearing each other down. Fear of missing out. Everybody else has got, in my life is just a sham compared to everybody else. Well, that's who Juan Diego was, and that's certainly the way many of those, that was my parish, I know many of those people. That's the way they felt. And when they see the story of Juan Diego, it's not a pious tale from the past. This is not just a pious apparition story. This is their life. What happened to Juan Diego happens to them. And what Guadalupe has been telling us for 500 years is, start paying attention to those people. This is where the gospel begins. Those who we have told and have been told in many ways, you don't count, you're not dignified, that's where the gospel starts. And this justice and human dignity, the Nican Mapoa, like the Gospel of Luke, is a story of great reversal. Luke, the poor are lifted up, the powerful are brought, all the great reversals in Luke. In the Nican Mapoa, the same thing happens. At the beginning, Juan Diego is out at Tepeyac, which is 3 miles outside of town, and the bishop is at the center of power, the cathedral at the central plaza. Juan Diego has to go to him. Juan Diego kneels before the bishop. At the end, the bishop goes out to Tepeyac, arm in arm with Juan Diego, and to build the Church of the Americas. And the bishop is the one who kneels before Juan Diego. The bishop, in fact, is challenged. He was building the first cathedral of Mexico at that very moment. But he's challenged to go build the church out on the margins where the Juan Diegos of this world live. So the whole story is a story of an upsetting of the values of this world and inserting the values of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a story about the justice that God wants us all to struggle for. That's not a ministry of the baptized. It's constitutive of what it means to be baptized. It's not an optional thing. It's what it means to be a Christian, to be a Catholic. So this was not always part, but in more contemporary times, You read the homily of John Paul II at Juan Diego's canonization. Pope Francis's beautiful homily in 2016 is replete with this message, and many of the theological writings, too many to mention here. This has been going on a long time, though, so this is the priest, Father Miguel Hidalgo, who's the George Washington of Mexico. When Mexico fought for its independence, they fought under the banner of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Cristero Rebellion, when the government began persecuting the church. Maybe you've seen that movie, The Power and the Glory. That's about the Cristero Rebellion. When the Mexican government, which is odd because Mexico was 99% Catholic, but an anti-clerical government began persecuting the church, and the peasants revolted to defend the church, to defend priests who were being martyred and nuns who were being harmed and exiled. This is a priest saying Mass for the Cristeros, and you see there, of course, prominently at that Mass, Guadalupe. And Cesar Chavez, the great organizer with Dolores Huerta of the United Farm Workers, who marched and protested for the rights of people under the banner of Guadalupe. Years ago, I don't know if you remember this, there was the Zapatistas, this sort of popular revolt in Chiapas, where these native peoples revolted against injustices of the Mexican government. And this was in the 1990s. And I was interviewed saying, well, what do you think the roots of this are? And I said, look, I don't know anything about Mexican politics. So I do know something about Our Lady of Guadalupe, so I'll tell you this. What's going on there is that for 500 years, Guadalupe told all of us, the church, society, leaders across the board, to pay attention to the natives, to pay attention to the Juan Diegos of this world. And this revolt is because we still haven't lived Guadalupe's message. We still are not paying attention to the most vulnerable and downtrodden among us. So that's a powerful theological message. I'm going to be going quickly here, so let me just go on to another one. Conversion. I find this to be very moving. We all know what conversion is. Of course, conversion is the center of the Christian life. Jason and I were talking about sometimes what happens with apparitions is they're just nice, almost fairy tale things to believe. And they don't get down to the real business of calling us to live the life of discipleship. Well, Guadalupe sometimes is taken that way among some of her devotees, but she has always been about conversion. And of course, conversion is the center of the Christian life. It's not how many beautiful emotional experiences I have at prayer. Remember, St. John of the Cross had many long-standing years that he didn't have very many emotional experiences at prayer. It's not the feeling I have. Feeling can be a beautiful gift from God. The touchstone of whether or not I'm living Christianity is, am I being transformed to become more like Christ? Is my life day by day, week by week, year by year, becoming more like Christ? I have an existential crisis every Lent. I don't know if that's true in my case, but I'm trying. At least I think about it every Lent. Am I moving ahead? And so conversion is putting off the old sinful person and taking on the new person who is Christ. And so we usually think about that, in terms of our Catholic theology and the scriptures and our Christian lives for the entire, 2,000 years of Christianity. We've been thinking about that in terms of turning away from sin and doing the will of our Heavenly Father, as Jesus said. And that's the model of conversion we usually go by. Sin starts usually with pride. I put myself above others, The original sin of Adam and Eve. What does Shakespeare said? Pride goeth before a fall. First I get proud, and then I commit sin. I meet the president of the institution. Oh, I'm at my best behavior. I see the janitor, and I just walk by like that person isn't even there. Because I'm too proud. I think I'm better than that person. And when I get angry at someone or when I do the things that I do, usually pride is in there somewhere. And the antidote to sinful pride is to submit myself to the will of God, to become more godlike. And that's our usual understanding of sin, grace, and conversion. I've put myself above others. I've even put myself above God. I know better than God. I follow my own will, not God's. And the grace of God comes in to humble me and to make me more accepting of not putting myself above others and of God's will. Now, that's good, but it's not the only model of conversion. Because in this story, Juan Diego's sin was precisely the opposite. he does not have a prideful sense that he's above others. The bishop does. The bishop thinks, I'm already saved, these people aren't. There's a real sense of kind of, spiritual superiority. Juan Diego, if you heard the passage I read at the very beginning, he has so internalized that sense of unworthiness that even when the Mother of God herself calls him dignified Juan Diego, it doesn't sink all the way in. I don't blame him for that. The natives suffered tremendous debilitating, but actually we all do. We all do. Even those of us who are proud have moments when we have great self-doubt. It's part of original sin. It's part of the human condition. But Juan Diego's root sin was not pride. It was self-abasement. And so what Guadalupe converts him to is a sense of his own humanity and dignity. The bishop has to go from pride to kind of a humble acceptance of his equality with others. Juan Diego is moving in exactly the opposite direction. His conversion is from an unhealthy self-abasement to an acceptance of what Genesis says. We are all made in the image and likeness of God. God did not make any junk. None of us are junk. And so the conversion of Juan Diego is the conversion of the self-negating person. Now, who are we? Are we Juan Zumárraga, the prideful one? Or are we Juan Diego, the self-denying one? And of course, I think you know the answer to that question if you look in your own heart. The answer is yes. We are both. We all can be guilty of that pride. But no matter how privileged we are, we all fall into the temptation of Juan Diego. And I dare say some of our worst sins come when I'm feeling so low about myself that I strike out at others in a futile effort to try to gain some sense of self-worth by defeating others or comparing myself to others, instead of just accepting that I was and am created in the image and likeness of God. So there's a powerful, powerful theology of conversion in it's not just in the Guadalupe story, but it's there powerfully. I thought of this years ago. I was thinking about these very things, and I went to Mass, and the priest gave a very good homily for me as a male. It was that text, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? No, I tell you, 7 times, 70 times. I remember when I was young, I used to think, 7 times, I was like in 3rd grade, 7 times, 7, I had 4 brothers, and we fought like cat and dog. God bless my mother. That woman, Saint Monica had nothing on my mother. My mother's 90 years old, still going strong. She's going straight to heaven because of us. I said, 7 times 70, okay. The 491st time that this irritating younger brother of mine offends me, I'm allowed to give it to him because it's 7 times 70, My mother explained to me that's not the way it was. But the homily that day was about the need to forgive, the need to give up our senseless pride, to humble ourselves, and to forgive. And having just thought about the theology of conversion in Guadalupe, I was looking around and thinking, what are some of I knew one woman in the church who I knew was in a very difficult marriage situation that probably involved physical violence. It certainly involved emotional violence. And I was sitting there thinking, how are those Juan Diego's people internalizing this sermon? Are they hearing, I now have to go back and forgive again and again, even if I'm suffering to the point of physical violence in my own home? We've been very used in the Catholic tradition to talking about conversion from the pride to submission model, which is very valid and very right. We forget the Juan Diego model. And I dare say those of you who are preachers or catechists or teachers, which I presume is a good number of us, we should be thinking about this all the time. I might give a beautiful talk on forgiveness, but the person who's hearing that talk, the unintended consequence may be that what they're hearing is, go back and take more abuse. That's what Jesus wants you to do. Because I dare say that beautiful homily I heard that one Sunday, I think there were probably people that Sunday who mistakenly got that message. Unintended. But that model of conversion in the Nican Mapoa is very powerful because we need to know both of those. There probably are others as well, but those two are fundamental, and they're in each one of us. And that theology of conversion, this Nican Mapoa is such a simple story, but it's so profound. It's so deep. This is the first known picture of Juan Diego going up the hill of Tepeyac. See the birds singing? That's what drew him up there. And so he's going up there to initiate his process of conversion. All right, I've got one on reconciliation. I'm going to skip it. I'm going to go to the final one, which is hope, and leave a little time for questions. I think this is a very important point, and in some ways, maybe this is the central message of Guadalupe. Because, when you think about it, we're about to have in 2031, in 7 years, the 500th anniversary of the Guadalupe tradition. And in 2033, 9 years from now, we'll have the 2000th anniversary of the death and resurrection of Christ. So Guadalupe came 500 years ago. She liberated Juan Diego. She restored his dignity. She gave him justice. She made him an evangelizer. She invited us to build the new Church of the Americas. That was 500 years ago. If you look at Mexico or the United States or maybe Canada too today, in some ways, skeptics could look and say, or even those of us who are believers and say, has things gotten better or worse 500 years later of Christianity being in these lands? This new church that's only been here 500 years in the Americas, this Church of the Americas. Have we made these lands better or worse? There's so many things. Mexico is a mess right now with cartels and drugs and the poverty that's always there and corruption, the poor people, the way they suffer. And Christianity could be the same thing. 2,000 years, Christianity has done so many good things. And yet, the world, in some ways, feels like it's in a more perilous state, with climate change and so many other things going on. We're in a more perilous state than we've ever been. So, what's really going on here? Guadalupe is obviously, and nor is Jesus Christ, some giant aspirin tablet that fell from the sky and fixed the world and made everything absolutely right. It's just not the case. I don't think any person with their eyes open and seeing the reality of life as it is can say that. And yet, what leads, and Jason's a philosopher, what leads some philosophically minded people to say, well, therefore, there must not be a God. Because if there was a God, these innocent people would not be suffering. Maybe you've heard this argument. This is a very common argument. We look at the suffering of the world and say, how could there be a good God in all this stuff going on? What the Guadalupe tradition teaches us is that very often, the people who ask that philosophical question, there's a good God, why do innocent people suffer? People who ask that question are very often those who are standing over the pit of suffering humanity, looking down and going, look at those people. I'm not going to believe if that's going on here. I'm going off to do something else. What we need to think more about is not just the problem of the suffering of the innocent. We need to think about the problem of the hope of those who are suffering. Because when we stand over the pit and look at suffering humanity, we might end up with the philosophical conclusion that this God you're talking about just doesn't exist. If you do what Guadalupe said to do, and get out of the capital, and go out to the margins where the Juan Diegos are, if you go down into the pit, where the people who are suffering, who supposedly disprove that there's a loving God, are, if you do what Elie Wiesel did and live through the Holocaust, and without denying the incredible, injustice and scandalous murder that was, and encounter the hope of people that against all odds still have hope, then you start to encounter what Christianity and what Guadalupe are all about. Guadalupe, no more than Jesus Christ, did not come to give us a giant aspirin tablet to solve all our problems. In fact, if you are trying to live your faith, maybe you've noticed sometimes it feels like you suffer more by living a Christian than somebody who seemingly, just living a carefree life and everything seems to be fine. Maybe that's not true, but sometimes maybe it feels that way. Guadalupe is not that giant aspirin tablet. She is hope that as we do our small part to make the world more in the image of what God wants it to be, that in the end, God is writing the final chapter to this story, and it's way better than we've imagined. And when you do what I've had the privilege of doing, work with immigrants and people who have this devotion, who have suffered way more than I can ever imagine, and when you ask them what they believe, will tell you right away, she never abandons me. She is always with me. As one woman told me after she excruciatingly crossed the Arizona desert, lost 2 of her companions on the way, and she said, we were talking about Guadalupe. I said, who is Guadalupe? She said, well, everyone says she's our mother and she's love, but let me tell you who she really is. She's hope in all we face. With her, we know we are never alone. And we don't know why we suffer, and we don't know the world the way it is. But there is something better is coming. There has to be. Because the way this world now is just simply cannot be the final way it's going to end up. And so ultimately, Guadalupe, I think, is about hope. And when you encounter the people who go to her, who by all measures should have given up on God a long time ago, and are so deeply fervent in the faith. Now, sometimes I get asked, why have you gotten so involved with Latino Catholicism? There's many reasons, but the bottom line reason is I'm a better Catholic because of it. Seeing the faith of the people I've had the privilege of encountering over these years and talking to and working with, I know I've learned so much from them because I look and say, they know what eschatological hope is. They know that, in the end, God is in charge, God's mother is in charge, and no matter what else happens, there is a reason to hope. I love this image. This is from San Antonio. That's just a little ice cream shop. That's the city line of San Antonio. And a local muralist said, where is Guadalupe? She's watching over the whole city. All the good, the bad, and the ugly, she's over it. And final picture. Oops. I got to show you that one. Wait a second. I went all the way back somehow. I love this one. People that bring their children dressed as Juan Diego to the feast day. A little immigrant child whose parents are suffering, whose parents are in danger of deportation, and from the very beginning they're teaching him, no matter what else happens, son, there's a reason to hope. Last story. One of my colleagues, Jeanette Rodriguez, a theologian in Seattle, she, in her book on Guadalupe and the Lives of Mexican-American Women, she asked people in Mexico, why is Guadalupe so important among all the other images of Mary in Mexico? Why is she the most important one? And she got different answers, but she asked one elderly indigenous woman who was begging coins at the door of the basilica, why is Guadalupe so more important to Mexican people than the other images of Mary? And she looked at her with the wisdom and the kind of bewilderment of the elderly, kind of like, why are you theologians, why are you asking such questions? Her answer was simple, 2 words. Why is Guadalupe more important than all the others? Se quedó. She stayed. She's been with us. We always know with her that no matter what else happens, we're not going to be alone. She's always going to walk with us. And with that, we have the strength to carry on and the hope that the way things are now are not the way they're going to end up. Thank you for your wonderful attention. And it's another miracle of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I finished more or less on time. It's very rare for professors, especially for me. So we do have some time. If you have questions, please, I'd love to hear them. Maybe kind of be brief so we can hear as many as we can. You can follow the advice of St. Thomas Aquinas on preaching. Veritas, claritas, brevitas. Okay? You want to start?
Thanks so much for the presentation. Really, really wonderful. So I just moved here recently from Texas myself.
Oh, great.
The area of Dallas we were in was a bit of the barrio. And you see all these images on these trucks that are very obviously grain trucks that look like Our Lady of Guadalupe, but they're Deus Muertas. And one of the things that was striking me about the way in which you're presenting the theology of Guadalupe as a theology of the downtrodden, this inverted conversion narrative, is that there's almost there's
It does, and I tried to address it at the end of my book, and I don't have a very good answer. Dia de los Muertos, actually, Santa Muerte, did you mean Santa Muerte? Santa Muerte is these images that narcotraficos and others use, and they kind of mimic the piety of Catholic piety like Guadalupe, but actually, praying to Santa Muerte, lighting candles as you would to a saint, so that I have a good drug run, or I kill my enemies. There's some very obviously insidious things here, and it's a real problem in Dallas and many other places now. That's an extreme example. I think your question pulls us back to, that one's kind of pretty easy to see. What about one that's more subtle? Because Guadalupe, because she's so powerful, gets co-opted for all sorts of other things. And like I say, I don't know if I have a very good answer because it's tricky. Theologians, I don't think it's fair game for us to say, wait a second, we're the theologians, we're in charge, that one's good, that one's not. I think like any interpretation or living out of the Christian faith, we have the scriptures, which are the sine qua non, we have the teachings of our church. So from if we're working in a Catholic framework, we can always say, private revelations must be consistent with the public revelation of the church. There are ways to discern this and to interpret it. But nonetheless, artists and others working in the Guadalupan realm now aren't working in the theological or faith dimensions of realm of the church. And so it gets trickier. Who are we to tell them they're right or they're wrong? In the end of the book, I did try to talk about this and say, we need a certain humility, especially as theologians. Nobody likes a theologian that comes out and says, I got the answers and you're a bunch of unenlightened people, But by the same token, I think one of the things I argued, even to the so-called secular interpreters of Guadalupe, if you want to call them that, if we study the history of the theologies, you can at least invite even non-Catholics to some kind of faithfulness to what it has meant. So that you can't just make whole cloth up a brand new meaning of it right now. Sometimes this, I think, applies even to our own fellow Catholics. There are some Catholics in the United States that want to make Guadalupe solely the patroness of the unborn. And I think Guadalupe, of course, is the patroness of the unborn. But she's not only that. And in fact, the Nican Mapoa is all about evangelization. So that's one of the people she's trying to dignify, the unborn, and very important. But let's not limit it to that. And that's one of those instances where, while it's a good interpretation, it's too narrow. I didn't say this because the topic was one of the theologies. In every practice of popular religion, of course, I think we are called as theologians and pastoral leaders to respect, accompany, and honor the piety of the people. But that doesn't mean we don't witness to our own faith, and as Paul VI said so beautifully, and other popes since then, evangelize the piety of the people. Because even good, faithful Catholics sometimes end up with pious practices that aren't consistent completely with the faith. If I could, one example, because I think that's an important point. I want to give an example. I was a youth minister in Texas before I went to study theology, and this woman came to me one day. Her son was in the youth group. She said, "Oh, Tim, I need money for gas. I need money for gas. I got to go to the valley, to San Juan del Valle, to the Oblate Shrine." It was an Oblate Shrine in the valley at that time. Now it's diocesan. I said, "What's the matter?" She was all upset. She said, "Well, my father, he had cancer a few years ago. And I made a promise to Our Lady of the Valley, that if his cancer went in remission, I would go and offer special prayers to her." And, she was a single mom with 4 or 5 kids. She said, "Tim, I never fulfilled my promise. And now the cancer has returned. And I got to go say that prayer." And I said, "Well, wait a second. Your father needs you. Your children need you. And you just don't go running off, But she really felt, and this was her pious belief, wasn't necessarily related to Guadalupe, but it was her piety, that God was going to punish her. And Our Lady was going to punish her because she didn't, and punish her father. So she kind of believed in this castigating God. Sometimes that happens in certain expressions of the piety of our Catholic people. So I said to her, I was just a young youth minister, I said, I didn't tell her she was wrong. I don't think we should tell people they're wrong. I said, the God of Jesus Christ and his loving Mother Mary, they're not like that. Jesus loves you. Jesus loves your father. Mary is watching over your father. She says, I know that, but it's me they're punishing. It's me, it's my. I said, no, but she would not be consoled. She didn't believe this young white guy telling her all this theology stuff, So finally I had an idea. The priest was an old priest, the Spanish-speaking priest was an old priest. And I said, before you go get in the car and go, because she was literally getting ready to start driving. I said, go see Father Raphael. You can go make your confession and tell him what you did. Be real honest and tell him your sin, and ask him if he can change your penance, give you a penance and change. She says, the priest can change my promesa in confession? I had no idea if that was true. I said, of course he can. I said, you go see the priest. She said, oh, Tim, I didn't know that. That's really good. So she wouldn't believe it from me. So she's walking across the church grounds, and I'm on the phone. I said, the secretary said, where's Father Raphael? She's taking a nap. I said, go wake him up. And he was a good guy. He was a really good priest. I said, Father, this is what happened. I said, she's almost to your door. He says, don't worry, young man, I got you covered. And 10 minutes later, I see her coming out smiling, rosary in hand, and going into the church. I said, good. She got her promesa reversed. But her piety had led her to a very castigating view of God. And while we should honor and love the people's devotion, and Guadalupe certainly, it's not our job to accept everything that comes from and we don't tell them they're wrong, but we can witness to what we feel is a more deep encounter with Christ and his mother that hopefully will help, as Paul VI said, purify the faith practices of the people. So that's a very important, there's so much more to say about that. Thanks for the question, it's very important. And Santa Muerte, I don't know if that one's redeemable. That has just been so taken over by destructive elements of the drug culture that it just, but you can buy those, I'm sure it's in Dallas, it's in San Antonio. You can buy those candles are on sale at the grocery store right next to the Guadalupe candles as if they're one and the same thing. And they certainly are not, but in the minds of many people, they start to become that. Yes. Oh, I thought the hand was up. Yes, in the back, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. As I was listening to you describe some of the stories, my question for you relates to a book that came out 2 years ago, and it's on a common good approach to development. And this has been in the works for a while, and it reflects a lot of Catholic social teachings and the common good. So my question for you is, there been any mention of Our Lady of and for the common good in any of the research that you've done?
Not precisely in that language, but when I mention the justice and the liberation and so on, that's very related to common good. But I don't know, for example, of a theologian or a major homily that's been given or a major teaching where Catholic social teaching common good language is specifically related to Guadalupe. That, to me, would be a wonderful theological project that easily could draw on the work that has been done on Guadalupe. You can find a lot of that Guadalupe and Justice, Guadalupe and Liberation stuff. That's a whole section of my Theologies of Guadalupe book. If you took the bibliography from that section and read some of those things, I think you'd find a flourishing, group of ideas to use that more specific language of common good from Catholic social teaching and build up. Because obviously Guadalupe is in favor and is consistent with Catholic social teaching, no question about it.
Thank you.
Way in the back, yeah, thank you, the young person.
By the way, I like you talking, and I was watching the picture right there of the child, and you didn't mention about the in history, that there were so many sacrifices, right, of children at the time. They used to sacrifice so many thousands of children, right, given to their pagan gods, right. But with the coming of our mother, that pretty much stopped that, because eventually murder, choices. So they stopped those
thank you. And it's another question that calls for many elements of response. I'll just give a couple. One thing is, I want to say this very clearly about the Nahuas and the Aztecs. They did have human sacrifice. It wasn't always children. Actually, it was mostly adults. The Europeans had their own form of human sacrifice. You know, the moral superiority that Europeans were fighting. You know, the wars between Protestants and Catholics in the 16th century killed way more people than the Aztecs were sacrificing on their altars. So I'm not justifying it, but obviously it was murder. But Christian Europe was not in a position to call other people barbarians from the perspective that we too were barbarians. And I think that's important to bear in mind, because usually when you study this in social studies classes, at least in the United States, it's kind of look at these savage people as if we weren't, you know, as if we don't, and as if we aren't today, you know, with mass murders and things that are going on. The Nican Mapoa actually doesn't say anything about the human sacrifice. If you look at Guadalupe's message, I mean, if we actually believe that this is the message of the Mother of God, she doesn't mention that. Clearly, Guadalupe is against it, but the way she is inviting the native people beyond that destructive practice is by saying, I'm your loving mother, and I want you to be loving of one to another, all the peoples of this land, not just the natives. But, you know, sometimes people say that Guadalupe came to stop human sacrifice. Well, I presume she did. She didn't, you know, the Mother of God does not want human sacrifice. I presume we're all Catholics. We don't need any proof of that. But that's not actually what she talked about. And it's not actually the way she, and that is only one element of what she came to destroy, because there were, you know, the conquest and all other sorts of destructive things that were going on. In terms of the abortion that's going to go on in Mexico now, and it's already going on, of course, in the United States and in Canada, the only thing I can say to that is the final point I ended with. 500 years later, yeah, se quedó, but she didn't solve all the problems for us. And in fact, as I said, in some ways, it looks like many things have gotten even worse instead of better. And so, just like Jesus 2,000 years ago didn't solve all humanity's problems, but in a sense, Jesus did do one very important thing. He appointed us to go out and be his agents of transformation in the world in the power of our faith, as we await in joyful hope for his coming that's going to transform all of these things and make them right. So, looking at the situation in Mexico, I guess it's the same as the situation in the United States. Did Guadalupe do something? Yeah. She told us to go out and be her messengers. And we need to keep doing it. But, you know, like I say, you got to go down into the pit, at least I do, to encounter people who have deeper problems than I do, because it is easy to look at the world and despair. I mean, we're about to have a national election in my country that's the most divisive in my lifetime. I can't believe what's going on in my country right now. You know, my wife and we're also getting older. And I think despair is easier when you're older. You know, you just say, oh, the hell with it. I'm going to die soon anyway. My job is just to get my soul ready. There's lots of reasons to despair when we see what's going on in the world. But that's Guadalupe and Jesus. They're not calling us to despair. They're calling us to be agents of hope and agents of change, even when we don't see all the results that we would like to see. I hope that helps a little bit, because I know I'm not answering your question fully. It's too profound of a question, too important of a question. Please.
My question's not as cerebral as the previous two gentlemen's questions, a little maybe more sensational, but I have heard that the images have been analyzed, and you know the pages hovering above the threads and the material and the tilma, the cloak, should have lasted 60 years and then rotted, and it's still around, and that they found that in her eyes, in Mary's eyes, it actually depicts the scene she would have been looking at. Do you know if these things are true or not? Have you heard about these? Or?
Oh, I've heard about them. This is my area of least expertise. I'm not a scientist. I mean, they show me these infrared pictures of things. You see it? It's Juan Diego and the bishop. I said, well, first of all, it can't be both Juan Diego and the bishop, because he was looking at the bishop. And if Juan Diego, but it looks like Rosh, what do you call that? Roshbach? I mean, you see what you want to see is what I feel sometimes. for people, for some people that is very, very important. And for some of these grassroots devotees, that's what they talk about. So it's very important to them. I have no conclusive evidence one way or the other. I mean, they've taken those infrared pictures, and some people swear, but they've examined. This has happened many times over the last 500 years, and it is amazing that that thing hasn't disintegrated yet. That at least is quite amazing. There have been debates. I've been part of them. I didn't want to talk to you about that tonight. It's the most boring thing about Guadalupe. Did the apparitions really happen? The historicity of the apparitions. There's big debates when Juan Diego was canonized. These debates have happened since the 1790s. It all boils down to this. For those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who don't, no proof is enough. I mean, we've had 300 years of that. And so the scientific stuff that you're talking about, the examination of the Tillman, so on, that falls into that category. It never seems to convince anybody. Occasionally someone is convinced. But usually the believers believe and non-believers are skeptics. I want to say something, though, that I think is important, because all I've given you now is a bunch of little scientific tidbits. I think the most important thing about Guadalupe's appearance is not that she appeared to Juan Diego 500 years ago. And let me out myself here. I believe there was a real person named Juan Diego who had a mystical encounter with Our Lady on the hill of Tepeyac. I've argued that in print. I've produced the historical, I don't go with all the historical documents that have been used in the canonization, because some of them, it's hard to date them. But I had a long argument with the most prominent anti-apparitionists in the United States, who happened to be a Catholic priest, who was against the apparitions. And I think my evidence is convincing, but that's me. But I don't just believe in Juan Diego as a pious act of faith. I think I have the historical evidence that there was a real person named Juan Diego who had a real mystical experience on the hill of Tepeyac. But the point I want to make is this. The appearance of Guadalupe to Juan Diego is just the beginning. What's most miraculous, if you want to use that word, what's most miraculous about Guadalupe is not that she appeared to Juan Diego, as wondrous as that is that she continues to appear every single day, millions of times to people, on tattoos, wall magnets, hanging from taxi cabs in Mexico City where she is desperately needed to protect people against the way those taxi drivers drive. In churches, Guadalupe's everywhere. She is constantly appearing to her people. Guadalupe is not just about some miracle in the distant past. It's about a living presence. If you studied the theology of icons in the Eastern Church, that icons are not just holy pictures, they're actually sacramental living presences of the sacred beings. That's what matters about the miraculous appearance of Guadalupe, that she continues to be present to millions and millions of people. And, please, some of Spanish-speaking Protestants in the United States, they'll go door to door and they'll say to Latino people, oh, the Catholic Church has taught you to believe in idols. You're worshiping, it's Mariolatry and so on. And sometimes, I'll admit, our Marian piety among some Latinos gets a little out of bounds. You got to remind them that Jesus is their son and she wants you to go to Jesus and so on. But for the most part, Guadalupe devotees understand very, very well that's just an image. But the image makes present a real person. In the same way, bread and wine is truly the body and blood of Christ. And it's not just the tilma in Mexico City. Notice this. That image over there is just a replica, so to speak. But put it in a devotee's home, on their home altar, in a parish. When they pray before that image, it is functioning like a sacramental icon. They are truly present to Guadalupe. And that daily miracle, repeated millions and millions of times, that's the story of Guadalupe. That what happened to Juan Diego happens and continues to happen to many, 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 many other people, because she is real to them and makes a real, she is truly present to them and makes a big difference in their lives. That to me is more important than the scientific evidence, which I honestly just don't have the expertise to really adjudicate very well. Maybe we should stop there. I'll take one more since your hand came up, please. And then I'll stay afterwards if anybody else wants to stay.
This may be a strange question, the Guadalupe is the patron of America.
Yes.
I think that notion, for instance, here in Canada, would be quite foreign to us. And in the U.S., because of the Latino population, I'm sure that it's more familiar. But here it's not as familiar. How does that take root in some place like Canada?
Well, maybe not too much. I mean, there's a couple little details here. I mean, the northernmost shrine to Guadalupe is in Cape Breton. Beautiful shrine. Wrong side of the country for you, I guess, but and the Canadian bishops actually declared the Guadalupe feast a national feast before the United States did. So at least your bishops at some point had a consciousness of this. But I get the point. I mean, she's declared the patroness of America. If you have devotion to a different image of Mary, I don't think any priest or anyone else is going to tell you can't pray to that. I mean, that always happens in Catholicism. St. Anthony's the patron saint of lost things. Not everyone has the patron saint. Until they lose their car keys, then St. Anthony comes in, and then they go to another saint, Remember one time, my sister showed me this article in The Onion. The Onion, this kind of funny newspaper that's telling mock stories? And it was an article written by St. Anthony, and St. Anthony said, that's it. I have told God I'm not going to be the patron saint of lost things anymore. Because when I became the patron saint of lost things, it was for lost souls. It was for lost people. I am sick and tired of people losing their car keys, their cell phones, and on and on. And so my sister and I were laughing hysterically at this. And my mother comes into the room, pious Irish Catholic woman, and she says, "What are you two laughing about?" And we said, "Oh, Mom, didn't you see this? St. Anthony has renounced his patronage." And she said, "That newspaper is lying. He helped me find my car keys this morning." So, it's not imposed. In the United States, actually, I always tell this to the seminarians when I teach the course on this. There's 22 countries where Spanish is a primary language. The United States is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Every one of them has their own national Marian patroness. So when you're in a parish in the United States, and I dare say the Hispanic parish you have here in Edmonton, they're not all Mexicans. And Bolivians are going to have their devotion to Our Lady of Copacabana. Peruvians to Nuestra Señora de los Milagros. Cubans to Our Lady of the Caridad del Cobre, and so on. And what I tell the seminarians in the United States is, be careful. Don't presume that because someone speaks Spanish that Guadalupe is their primary Marian image. It might be, in fact, it might be offensive to them because you're leaving out the one from their country, because the one from Mexico has now been declared the one of the whole hemisphere. So I think saying that she's the patroness of America means, Canada's involved. It doesn't mean that you have to drop everything else. And I do think, especially those of us who are dedicated to Guadalupe, have to be careful to not be kind of chauvinistic about it. There's lots of saints up there, and there's lots of images of Mary, and they all lead to God. So, if you have another one that's more important to you, I don't think any Guadalupano is going to hold that against you, and they certainly shouldn't. And if you're in ministry in a parish where Spanish is being spoken, it is your pastoral responsibility to know what country those people are, countries they're from, and what kind of devotions matter to them, and not just think, oh, Spanish, it's Guadalupe, because it's just simply not the case. And if you lived in Texas for a while, you would know this instantaneously, because people will tell you, that's not my devotion. I have this other devotion. And why isn't it being honored at the parish along with Guadalupe and the other ones? And with Latinos, you can never do enough for the Virgin Mary. You can have 15 Marian feasts, and they'll want 5 more. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing Guadalupe, and Guadalupe usually is bigger in the United States because most of our Latinos are Mexican. 2/3 of Latinos in the United States are Mexican. But if you do a small thing for Caridad del Cobre and another one for, Aparecida, no one's going to complain. It's all the Virgin Mary. They love the Virgin Mary. It'll all go fine. All right, this is the last one.
It's not so much a question as just a comment, because the same question about Our Lady of the Patroness of America, for Canadians, it's sensitive in the way that, 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 in people from the United States, for instance, will go around saying, I'm an American. And I'm going, well, kind of, I'm a North American, we're over here, you know. So it can be sensitive, but I think we need to understand that I think she was given the title to Patroness of the Americas. And even the plaza in front of the Basilica in Mexico City was called the Plaza of the Americas. And when John Paul II was there, he said, take off the S. I want you to start functioning like one continent. And so when we hear she's referred to as the patroness of America, we need to understand as Canadians that it doesn't mean the United States of America. It means the America as a whole continent. And
yeah, that's very true. And you know, the problem, and I studied in Toronto, so I've learned early on in life some of the sins of those of us who are from the United States. But only some. There's many more that I still have to work on. But people in Latin America have the same complaint about the way in the United States we use the word America. That's not just Canada. So when the Pope said that, I don't even know how much he was thinking of Canada at that moment. He was thinking of all of Latin America. Because when, you know, and people in Spanish, people will say that all the time. When you say so-and-so is Americano, he's an American, they'll say, from which part of him? I mean, they'll say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but they're pointing out to you, you have taken a word onto yourself that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us. So, however we say it, we should be cognizant of the fact that it's not just one country. And there's only one country that's guilty of that sin, and it's mine. All the other countries complain about that one country.
the church documents, when we read of Our Lady of Guadalupe's patroness of America, it's not intended to be patroness of the United States.
Absolutely not. I mean, read what John Paul II said. Precisely, he's saying, from Tierra del Fuego to the northern, these are his words, from Tierra del Fuego to the northernmost regions of Canada is all one continent, all one hemisphere. That's America, and that's clearly what he's saying. And, you know, there is a dig at the United States in that statement. You know, like, stop presuming that you are in charge of everything and become part of the group instead of apart from the group. But we have a long way to go to get there, I'm sorry. I'll talk to you after November the 5th. Maybe we'll make a few more steps in the right direction. Friends, thanks again for your great attention. I'll wait around. Thank you.
He is a member of our Senate.